you have enough funding, you get along with OMB, what's taking so long? And I don't really want to ask you because, you haven't been there long enough. I appreciate that. I'm not going to blame you. What about some of the guys behind you? Have they been there long enough to answer the question? Because there's got to be somebody there who's been there more than a couple of months.
Well, Congressman, I believe that a good part of the staff at PHMSA shares the same frustration you do and that I do about moving regulations through.
Well, I understand that, but I mean, I get all that. But, come on, 8 years? 8 years? And we're not talking about small, unimportant things. We're talking about a regulation talking about what's the maximum pressure that can be used in a pipeline. I think that's kind of important, and I don't know a whole lot about pipelines. I just know if you put too much pressure in a balloon, it pops. And I assume the same thing happens with pipelines. We're talking about pipelines, automatic or remote shut-off valves. Why? Because pipelines are pretty long, and they go through long areas where there's nobody there. And if you don't have those, somebody has to get in a truck and drive for hours to go shut off a valve that's gone pop. Those are the kinds of regulations we're talking about, not small little things. And you're telling me we have enough staffing, you have enough funding, you get along with OMB. I don't understand the problem. And the reason I ask is because we go through this every once in a while. PHMSA is a relatively new agency. I know you know that. Reauthorization is coming up, I think, next year. I'm trying to ask myself, why should I have an agency that I actually believe in? I think it's the right thing to have PHMSA. But if you're not doing your job, why bother? And if I do have you, why shouldn't we tie your funding to actually getting some of the job done? Now, again, I'm not kidding to sit here and argue about regulations that are 6 months overdue. Fine, I get all that. 8 years? 8 years for not just one difficult regulation, but for multiple. And again, I don't want to blame you. You haven't been there 8 years. Has there anybody who's been there for 8 years?
Yes, there's a number of staff that have been there 8 years.
I'm a little bit more than frustrated, to be honest with you. I'm kind of angry. I would rather be sitting here fighting with you about the substance of your regulations that maybe I don't like or whatever, but I can't even do that. Honestly, when you want to build pipelines, it makes my job darn near impossible to look at my constituents and say, trust PHMSA. Trust somebody that your safety is good. When I don't have a regulation that says, what's too much to put into the pipeline? When I don't have a regulation that says, how are we going to turn these things off when they do fail? When I don't have an agency that sits there and tells me something on the order of 35 to 50% of the accidents we have had are preventable. It feels like nobody cares. Now, I know that's an overstatement, and I actually think you care, and I actually like PHMSA. I like when you do stuff, you seem to do it pretty well. But it seems like when you don't want to do stuff, you just don't do it. And for me, that kind of bodes poorly for reauthorization. It means I'm going to be looking at ways to get you to do your job. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm hoping when reauth comes around that these are done and you can sit there and say, Congressman, we did them all, and I'm going to clap, and that's great, and let's move forward. But if not, of course, by that time, I'll be sitting in the big chair where Mr. Denham is. That's called optimism. And when we are, we're going to have a different conversation. Again, I know you knew, and I don't mean to beat you up, but you knew this was coming. It's not what you do, it's what you don't do. That you haven't been asked to do, you've been required to do. These are not requests. And by the way, mandates from Congress are exempted from the President's own executive order, that 2-for-1 nonsense. If you got an old regulation, you should repeal it anyway. You shouldn't have to be told by daddy to repeal something that's no longer useful. Those are exempt. I appreciate you being here today, and I appreciate the chairman's tolerance.
Congressman, my job, my responsibility is to make you feel good about PHMSA again.
Thank you. Mr. Faso, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Elliott, the concern that I have is along the lines with what Mr. Capuano was expressing in his very expressive way, the delay on the hazardous liquid rule, for instance. I represent a district in upstate New York that includes, among the 11 counties I represent, Schoharie County, where in 1991 there was a explosion along a propane gas line in Blenheim, New York, that killed 2 people. And obviously, you can't go to that community today and talk about pipelines without many people having a very vivid recollection of that. So I'd like you don't have to respond on this today unless you can,